I would like to start with, an historiographical consideration. Since the 1950s, the category of Nicodemismo has had some success within Italian historiography. Well, to put it very, very simply, that category tried to account for the behavior of many 16th century religious dissidents who disguised their ideas, either openly heretical or simply critical, behind conformist practices. In other terms, words and deeds would confirm to orthodoxy, but the ideas deep inside would be marked by heterodoxy. It was obviously a category that tended to respond to a momentous trauma, the Counter-Reformation, but somehow had to do also with the consent given by many intellectuals to the fascist regime. The Italy coming out from the World War II had to deal not only with the reconstruction, but also with the attempt to explain how the dictatorial regime could have enjoyed such a broad consensus. Even among intellectuals, the big majority of those who had not openly flanked the regime had kept silent. Nicodemismo therefore intervened as an explanation for that silence. The silence of the intellectuals before the Counter-Reformation somehow had to legitimize that before a regime that had passed the racial laws and led Italy to an alliance with Nazism. This is not what I want to talk today. Moreover, the category of Nicodemism has been widely considered over the years. Well, no silence today, not silences. I would rather talk about outspoken disagreements today, explicit and voiced loudly, sometimes shouted. The case study I will consider is that of Venice between 17th and the 18th century, and I would like to highlight how at that time and in that context, the construction of an arsenal of dissident ideas was part of a process, self-construction and definition. Some preliminary words about Venice, what we are talking about. Venice was the capital at the time of a quite big state in... I'm looking for the mouse, okay, here. For a quite big state, you can see the map. It's quite explicit. I know that you know everything about Venice, but I don't know. I cannot expect that you know very well the size of the town, and the size of the town is important for my argument. This is the Kingdom of Venice. This is a representation of the town at the beginning of the 16th century, and that's Palazzo Ducale that a lot of you maybe knows. Now Venice is known for this kind of stuff: masks, ships. It's why I show you this kind of stuff, because I want to give you an idea of the dimension of the city. Venice was not a big city, was a overpopulated city. It was a little town with 180,000 inhabitants. So with a density of population very high. I would like to show you today some of these stuff, and to carry you around the city and listen to people talking about religious dissent. Okay, since the late 16th century, Venice gave the impression of a place no longer in harmony with the Counter-Reformation. Those arriving in the city must have found a world characterized by different forms of heterodox unrest, which benefited from a plethora of opportunities to take hold, spread, expand, and feed off each other. It was a world in which Counter-Reformation vigilance could not manage to hide the cracks in a religiousness pervaded by doubt and often denied. A world in which elements of dissent borrowed from more organized heretical movements had the effect of strengthening a somewhat muddled and indefinable forms of irreligiousness. Therefore, with regard with the period I want to talk about, the problem is not to identify propositions or theories which inherently belong to one or other heterodox tradition. Instead, it was more a question of seeing, for example, how a Lutheran view could evolve, blend with different elements, or contribute to creating a certain degree of irritation towards dogma and the authorities, or anything perceived as dominant and oppressive in morals and behaviors, and finally, mature into an incredulous, skeptical, unbelieving, or libertine attitude, along with the associated meanings that these terms embody. There was a huge grey area in which heterodox unrest of different origins combined and where distinguishing features faded and blended into one into another. Indeed, those who expressed dissent against Catholicism did not give the impression that they were knowingly drawing on organic theories and structured tradition or religious dissent. Instead, they seemed to be trying to express themselves and highlight their individuality. In this way, a kind of patchwork philosophy was created in which elements of different origins were assembled, built up by accumulation, and expounded during conversations. Conversation and, I quote, coming across as a wit, diventar begli spiriti, parer per gli spiriti, were becoming a fashion. Believing in something unorthodox or having belief-related doubts made more sense as a way of communicating personal difference. Non-belief assumed a particular significant meaning when it was expressed. Now, one of the advantages of dealing with a later period and an unusual urban context like Venice is being able to partly avoid supplying a clear answer to the genealogical question regarding libertinism among popular classes in the terms which emerged from the debate between Carlo Ginzburg, I think you know perfectly him, and the critics of Carlo Ginzburg. The case was that of the cheese and the worms. In the cheese and the worms, by analyzing the case of Menocchio the miller, Ginzburg identified a hidden layer of popular culture which provided a link between cultural contexts separated in time and space, and which created a filter for subjecting Menocchio's readings to radical interpretations. Some, however, offered a different interpretation, suggesting that the miller's theories were distorted versions of doctrine from the educated tradition, which had reached Menocchio through different but nevertheless identifiable channels. As I said, it is plainly difficult to establish the genealogical pattern of this knowledge in the Venetian context in the period in question. What is historically proven, however, is that chains of contact and means of communication provided a link between different social strata. Moreover, heterodox unrest with leanings towards Averroism, Cleavenism, and Aristotelianism was widely present among the patriciate in Venice. In a 1686 libellus manuscript, started to circulate in the city and was reproduced several times by copies, thus reaching a wide audience. It was untitled, and its author was unknown, but it was able to claim, with regard to noblemen in Venice, that, I quote, when they are elected to the government and the supreme courts, the first oath they swear is that they don't believe in God, and that they will form a permanent alliance against the Holy Church and an infinite number of other similar more damned things. In itself, the accusation was no more than a variation of the stereotypical apostatic oath always attributed to heretics, witches, and deviants in general. However, it was also an accusation directed at a social group deemed incapable of believing in anything that, I quote, that is higher than the roofs, which was distinguished itself for its ability to maintain independence from Rome, and on several occasions had proven its skill in manipulating religion and forms of worship for political ends. Well, while there is no doubt that popular unbelief and irreligiousness emerged even without academic stimuli, after all, anyone could conclude that there was little divine participation in human affairs on the basis of personal experience and intellectual ability, however limited it might have been. But it is just as certain that the relevant set of ideas was complete and available from at least the mid-17th century onwards. Each idea could be taken in, adapted, and imported again by a potentially huge number of people. In a certain sense, in the special urban context of Venice, the problem was not so much the presence of a person like Menocchio, but the fact that there were hundreds of Menocchio, diverging statements, ideas, depictions, and visions of the world, which each individual then interpreted for himself. Venetians must have been bombarded with information and interpretations. It was normal for educated and popular thought to converge, and erudite libertine themes and arguments also spread widely among the artisan and popular classes in the city, although more in terms of their formulation than the structure. Reason was used in a critical capacity with a series of instruments that were more immediately linguistic than conceptual. They were thoughts which were often standardized, an inevitable consequence of the available repertory of emotions, vocabulary, and conceptual instruments. But there were sometimes even significant differences between individuals. In this sense, heterodox discourse could assume a more or less infinite number of forms, each embellished by the individual character of its proponent. The success and resulting spread of an idea were also a question of the language through which it was expressed, or the images which it lent itself to be translated into. This basically depended on the underlying communicative potential of the idea itself. For example, Teodoro Stricker, a doctor in law, was a staunch supporter of God's indifference towards human affairs and the material nature and mortality of the soul. He was ready and willing to take part in a new assembly so that he could, in Concilio, so that he could voice his opinions. He shared his views with a broad group of people, including lawyers, notaries, drapers, and workers from craftsmen's bottega, and managed to find the right arguments to influence different groups. He not only quoted doctors to support what he was saying, but also offered bold interpretation of divine signs. When he could not find any fish at the market during Lent, he said that, I quote, "As God hadn't sent any fish, it was a sign that he wanted us to eat meat, thereby telling the gospel." The ability to move an idea from the world of reflection to concrete, sensory, and perceivable ground involved a series of linguistic instruments. All these favored the element of exchange, or rather the appropriation of fragments of arguments by those who took part or were present at the public presentation of such thoughts. The result was not complex theories, but reworking of pieces of discourse put together by accumulation. Ideas heard in discussions, read or heard read aloud, and then adapted to personal inclinations or an individual's ability to understand them. This patchwork technique was constantly used in anchorage to reality of formulae or ideas that needed to be presented in a comprehensible form. For example, the presence of God and the credibility of religion were primarily measured on the basis of everyday facts in terms of moral values and prescriptive codes. Religion and the next word answered to a very earthly kind of logic made up of exchanges, payments, and compromises. Whether the currency in question was prayer or a good deed, something was expected in return. This made it easier to move from one belief to another, or in extreme cases to pass from belief to unbelief. Nicolò Rompiasio, a merchant, built his 1722 vision of the world on completely empirical foundations. He denied providence, I quote, and touching the bag in which he kept some money with his hand, he said, "This is providence. Go to Christ and beg him for some money. Pray to him and tell him about the prayers, and you'll see that he'll kick you in the face. He then moved on the soul. I quote again, and I beg your pardon for the language, fucking soul. Have you ever seen a soul? When you die, there's nothing more, end quote. The real grace of God could be experienced, I quote again, when one's belly is full, end quote. While heaven did not exist, and if it had existed, it would have been a dangerous place because, I quote again, those who go up really high end up falling down and breaking into 100,000 pieces, and if Christ is in heaven, he can stay there, end quote. His best evidence for the assertion that Christianity was worse than Jewish and Muslim laws came from personal experience. Quote, go to a Christian to ask him to help you, and then go to a Jew. You'll see that the Jew will help you, and the Christians won't. This skepticism toward church teachings did not require solid arguments, as it was self-evident, based on experience, and boasted a strong tradition. Back in 1576, Matteo Vincenti, a turner, said that if he really had to believe in something, then he preferred to believe that he had money in his pocket than in God. It's kind of variation of Woody Allen quotation about bacteria, I think. Then in 1646, a certain Ursula Turan, Ragman's wife, did not hesitate to say that, I quote, the soul is filth, and those who do not love their body do not love their soul either. What is hell? Nobody has met anyone that came here to tell us. She was also regretted having sometimes wasted her time on confession and the Eucharist. The constant repetition of such fragments of discourse, whether shouted or whispered, had the effect of consolidating beliefs and encouraging individuals to display increasing conviction. This kind of everyday doctrinal discussions give the impression of an environment in which everyone had a ready repertory of strong ideas and belief. Although it is impossible to understand and measure in detail how deeply people embraced unbelief and heterodoxy, it is possible to focus on moments of formulation and expression, the moments when ideas became words taking shape through a ready vocabulary and a varying repertory of other guidelines ideas. The positions in front of the Holy Office, my main sources here are the position in front of the Holy Office, the Inquisition active in Venice. This deposition clearly revealed the aesthetic aspect of the way in which ideas were expressed. The very fact that concepts in a heterodox mode were frequently the subject of conversations and arguments shows that for many people they were like a calling card bearing the qualification of virtuoso, a beau esprit. In 1651, when the Dominican friar Tommaso Honorio claimed that religion was literally a diabolical idea, that everyone was saved in their own law, that the Trinity was an invention, that friars could have carnal relations with anyone, and that consequently the government of, quote, papists were tyrannical, the prior of the monastery found no reason to be upset. He had often heard him saying these things, but felt that he was still a good friar at heart. Because one, I quote, says certain things only to be a bell'ingegno, or as we usually say, a galantuomo, to look as a wit person. This stance was common to more or less all anti-libertine polemics and literature. According to Filippo Maria Bonini, the author of a well-known book on atheism around 1680s, wits ended up renouncing religion because of, I quote, avarice of knowledge, shipwrecked, I quote again, in the stormy sea of fluctuating philosophies. It was, I quote, wanting to pass for a singular mind that put the soul in danger. It was a feeling that governed many heterodox expressions of opinions and manifestations of unbelief. Those brave enough to utter them in public, or at least hint at them, knew that they would become objects of both scandal and esteem, or at the very least would be noticed. The result was the creation of a complex world of people preaching their heterodoxy, inspired by a wide range of different reasons. One therefore became a bell'ingegno, a wit, and a galantuomo, I could translate with a noble spirit, by putting forward propositions, theories, or simple formulations that could create scandal, perhaps by treating lightly subjects usually considered to be sacred. In January 1708, Gasparo Ranaldi, a count from Vicenza, rented a room in the house belonging to the Colonna brothers, Giovanni Albise, a lawyer, and Giovanni Francesco, a secular priest. Yeah? Sorry, a secular priest. During their frequent conversations, Arnaldi claimed, among other things, I quote, that God was imprudent in creating flies, that he does not believe that the soul is immortal, and that this is the opinion of virtuosi, the virtuous, the wit, that the pontiff was not able to deceive the English as he did to others. And furthermore, he spoke ill of the subject of indulgences and the worship of holy images. He felt that confession was a political invention, one of the many that could be found in the holy texts, which pontiffs had supplemented with whatever they wanted. He also saw the text as badly argued. A roast lamb made him think that out of all the things that Christ could have been compared to, the Church had chosen a lamb which was, I quote, utter balderdash. Similar language was used in the ongoing development of social moods characterized by freedom of thought and unprejudiced intelligence. It was now firmly established that the wise, the sage, the virtuous were not those who led lives based on solid moral principles and piety, but those who did not believe in anything, who questioned even the most untouchable dogma and were not deceived by the artifice of religion, a political instrument in the hand of the powerful to keep the others under control. Everybody played along as it was a part of the social order, but the important thing was to make it clear that one knew the rules. There were times in which, as Giovanni Francesco Loredan, the chief of the Incogniti Academy, wrote, I quote, "Those who don't know how to disguise the truth don't know how to live." However, in order to disguise the truth had to be known, and those who knew how to live certainly had the means to do so. In 1682, the abbot Francesco Musellani claimed that, I quote, "Idiots believe that purgatory and the house of the devil exist, but not a good educated man like myself." End quote. Even the existence of heaven and hell was acknowledged. Giuseppe Rossi, a doctor, claimed in 1692 that it would be preferable by far, I quote, "to go where many faithless emperors, such as Tiberius Nero and others, have gone for company, rather than to go to heaven with 4 fishermen for company." Giacomo Stecchini learned from a painter who taught him the profession that, I quote, "children go to heaven," but later developed and expounded its own variation in around 1711, according to which, I quote, "heaven was the heaven of idiots." Daniele Alberti in Mestre took a more argumentative approach in 1719 when he tried to persuade friends and servants, I quote, that souls move from one body to another, speaking about the souls of men, because he was referring the opinions of great virtuous figures, also saying that only idiots and ignorant people go to heaven, and only great virtuous men go to hell, and that he wanted to go to hell among the great and virtuous men. This was a restatement of the notorious Machiavelli's dream. The connection between an individual's intellectual stature and the lack of involvement in matters of faith was an implicit one, but was clearly seen by many. People thought that they could become similar to educated men by reinventing themselves under their guide and repeating their beliefs, and that their words could be used as instruments of verbal conflict. To this end, in around 1670s, Marquis Francesco Maria Santinelli and Vincenzo Pezzi, a doctor, urged the merchant Francesco Giusto, I quote, not to believe in the sacraments, saying that good philosophers do not believe in anything but nature. While in April 1699, during a conversation with bookseller and editor Domenico Lovisa, Paolo Marchesi Vedova, a lawyer for the Santa Maria warehouses, told him, I quote, the opinion of most great men that when the body is dead, the soul is dead too. If the reference model was great men or philosophers, there was certainly not much point in hiding one's thoughts, as they became instruments used to earn social distinction. A few decades previously, the unknown author of the Theophrastus Redivivus had established the idea by stating that all truly wise men knew how to examine reality and discover the deceit of religion. The idea that it was philosophers, virtuosi and wits who could read the deceit of those in power and religion had become widespread and firmly established at all levels of society. The people in question moved against orthodoxy by turning their free thinking against the intellectual and physical constraints of their religion and taking more of an interest in its political phenomenon. It was precisely for this reason that being informed about the news of the world was one of the main presumed features of a virtuoso de wit. It was for the delectation and the convenience of gentlemen curious in a virtuoso way that in 1716 Almoro Albrizzi decided to bring the newsletter which reports of the latest war against the Turks. While on one hand the custom of discussing news created a predisposition for skepticism, on the other hand skepticism, even in its religious form, was a characteristic that raised a person to the status of wit. As far as the religious aspect was concerned, there was also an explicit assertion of superiority and differentiation in their derisory sneers at devout and wisecracks. In this sense, the attempt to distinguish oneself from common people, which was a typical feature of the libertinage érudit, included an elitist conservative component, and was more a question of attitude and way of talking than of social belonging. The elitism of these libertines was more a personal vindication of specificity than a social factor, an attempt to classify society on the basis of freedom of thought rather than social class. It was, however, an attempt expressed through the available instruments, namely social inequality and a perceived correlation between the concepts of the people and general ignorance, even though this distinction was sought by members of the people themselves. Instead of complaints made in name of social class, there was individual indication of difference from other members of the same class. As I said previously, nobody in principle questioned the theory according to which politics, knowledge, culture, readings, and unbelief were matters for the elect few, and that there would be disastrous consequences if they became common property. The common consensus was that it was right for these areas to be separated and protected. Secrecy was an essential requirement, both for official holders of a high knowledge and users of discourse about the knowledge. The fact was that from the mid-17th century onwards, an increasingly larger number of individuals felt that they could join the restricted group and therefore become one of those detached from the masses. The implicit agreement was that there were things which others should not speak about, special hidden sectors of knowledge reserved for a few people. More and more people abided by this assumption with regards to others, so the process of the exclusion, which formed the basis for a new identification based on the discussion and argument, was widely practiced but never directed to exclude themselves. In other words, as Erlet Farge wrote, everyone assumed the right to speak and think, and this universal self-licensing, punctuated by a repression which did nothing to weaken it, gave rise not so much to new forms of version as to a refinement in cognitive and reflective capacities. The originality of this period lies in the forms taken by discussions and criticism than in their actual content. The very fact of developing dangerously deviant ideas and accepting that religion was an instrument of social control made people feel that they belonged to an elite group by right. They attributed terms such as ignorant or idiot population on the basis of a distinction wholly founded on the idea of doctrine regardless of their personal positions. A large number of great and literate people, I quote, told Ursula Ciurana, a junk dealer, that hell didn't exist, that the sacraments were ineffective, and that the soul was mortal. Indeed, so many that they were described as, I quote, almost the whole world. Ursula shared these truths with her fellow tenant Maddalena, and, I quote, they both decided to refuse to receive the Holy Sacraments. In an attempt to imitate educated people, one, I quote, one really needs to say something in order not to come across as a baboon. This was the justification offered by the artisan Grando de Grandi in 1692, after he had been reprimanded for suggesting that the soul was mortal and that the hereafter didn't exist. Putting forward ideas associated with the wits introduced an element of difference, creating distance between the proponent and the baboons, who were unable to understand them. It was the same for political news. According to the author of a Pasquinade in around 1665, conversations about the news of the world among gentlemen took place at, I quote, unknown hours of the night, speaking a language which cannot be understood by baboons. This stance was also in some way connected to the view that books were, I quote, bound to keep the truth hidden and keep the people in subjection, and that bonds were only, I quote, for idiots, to use the forthright words attributed to the philosopher Michelangelo Farbella in 1689. This was a fairly widely used image put forward, for example, in 1668 by the French Dominican friar Giovanni Battista, a staunch supporter of the superiority of temporal power over spiritual power. He said that, I quote, he had no scruples about his faith from reading banned book, and that books are banned for ignorant people and idiots. In 1705, the Count Cristoforo della Torre went around saying, I quote, that books are banned for ignorant people who might draw evil from them, but not for the educated who can distinguish good from evil and for whom it is not sin. The laughter with which Don the priest Giorgio Cappuccio and Mariana Fabis answered a reproach from Marco Tiziani, who believed that banned books should only be read after obtaining a license, must have been more or less in the same vein. It was 1754, and Giorgio claimed that, I quote, banned books can be read without a license, and that the church only requires a license so that people submit. He went on to say that any banned book could be read. The wits, the virtuosi, therefore professed a range of liberties for themselves, first of all in the sphere of thinking, then in reading, and finally, almost inevitably, in sex. In 1736, Andrea Pisani, a doctor, revisited the stereotype of the wit, of the virtuoso, applied not only to heterodox positions, but also to sexual liberty. In his opinion, I quote, whoring was not a sin, and he envied Turks who could keep a large number of women. If he had been a prince, he would have done it too, but in any case, he believed that marriage, I quote, was something for fools, and only ignorant people and idiots get married. and that philosophers and educated people, just he was a philosopher, never get married, but keep several women for their pleasures, because this was not a sin. After all, I quote again, in the law of nature, man kept several women because they had been created by God for the enjoyment and pleasure of man. Personal forms of dissent were then exhibited in public, put on show so that others could admire them. Beyond any effective adherence to a position, the main focus was on critical observation, and nothing could achieve this better than comparing one's own opinion with those of the others. Discussions and arguments were also governed by their own set of rules. I quote, "At the time, I was beside myself because we were in conversation," was how the priest Pietro Mariani tried to justify himself in 1679. Theological discussions was seen and presented as a kind of free-for-all area where beliefs could be expressed and argued for the pure pleasure of debate. It was a practice in which it was allowed to break through the formal veneer of obedience and conformism that people tried to safeguard under normal conditions. The following was a popular anecdote. At the start of the 18th century, a nobleman and a Jew were having a conversation in St. Mark's Square. When the bells rang for midday, the Jew showed no sign of uncovering his head for the customary prayer, at which the nobleman slapped him. Somewhat perplexed, the Jew apologized, saying that he was, as a Jew, he didn't not feel obliged to believe in such an outward act. The nobleman replied that he believed in it even less, but that one must never let one's singular nature stand out in public or ignore what others did. As Don Giuseppe Zanchi claimed early in the second half of the 18th century, in order to come across as practicing member of this religion full of make-believe, in order not to fall into disfavor among those people who, under the pretext of defending the cause of God, have assumed the right to defend the religion, one can even appear regularly at the confessional or at the altar receiving the Eucharist. The confessor can be told things of no importance. Communion can be received as if it were a stamp for a letter. Those men and women who obey nature without the prejudices of religion live longer and much happily than those who conform and obey the religious precepts and institutions which are made up. A separation can therefore be detected between a physical act that denoted a lack of belief and words pronounced at the same end. They were not always coordinated, and when they were, the question moved from the field of heterodoxy to the sector of reason and thus heretical blasphemy. There was more concealment in the area of gestures and behavior than in conversation, unless it was carried out in selecting the times and locations where conversation took place. Therefore, speech and discussions were aspects of social life where one could express oneself, or at least they were believed to be thus. In 1651, another friar, maybe you are perplexed from the fact that I continuously quote friars, but friars and priests are the preferred clients of the Holy Office in the 17th and 18th century. So in 1651, the friar Enrico from Venice heard his fellow brother Tommaso Honorio repeat the entire repertory of libertine propositions on several occasions. He didn't think too much of it, I quote, thinking that he was saying it for the sake of argument and did not really mean it. This was a credible line of defense for most of the accused that appeared before the Sant'Uffizio, the Holy Office, and there is no reason to doubt that the fact for many it must have really been a pastime or rhetorical exercise which did not necessarily imply adherence to the proposition expressed. I quote, "In a debate, one can even question whether God really exists," claimed the friar Elia Borghi in 1687, "and the light shines better amidst the darkness." Similar attitudes to those of Menocchio the Miller, who frequently told his fellow villagers that he wanted to speak to the authorities about his opinions regarding faith, were fairly widespread. This states for argument, opportunities to exchange ideas, and the agnostic element of thought was defined well by the words of Giovanni Bresciani in the early 18th century. He had asked himself a question about divine justice on several occasions and concluded that it did not exist. He soon tired of speaking to myself, so, okay, sorry, 40 minutes, I just 3 minutes and I finish. He soon became tired of speaking, he said, with myself, and so I was extremely tempted by the desire to find a learned man to have a discussion with, and I thought that nobody would be able to convince me and settle my doubts about faith. Therefore, I wanted to meet the most learned man in the world, because I had wanted to discuss these things for a long time, and on other occasions I expressed my doubts to others and put forward some problems. Equally, those listening often entertain the desire to compare heterodox ideas with their official equivalents and create a kind of entertaining show. For example, after hearing Troilo Lanzetta, a doctor, question the mortality of the soul in 1661, Antonio Stella, a hosier, invited the priest Giovanni Francesco Privoli several times to speak to him, I quote, because he is a philosopher. Antonio told of how, during their discussions, the doctor sometimes said that, I quote, he confessed before the Lord God every evening and said that man had to be decent because the Lord God rewards the goods and punishes the bad, meaning that everything is used up in this life. End quote. Antonio knew that these were not solid admonitions in keeping with the faith, but, I quote again, I say to myself that there were lots of other provident and wise people who knew the life of this doctor, and he was left in a state of bewilderment. To sum up, if some people, the majority, wanted to believe, an increasing number of people, of other people wanted not to believe. Reasons were different. Sometimes it was an aesthetic act, some other they deeply realized the absence of God, sometimes they were just drunk, but it's not a problem. But anyway, religious dissent was a mean they could try to use to find a new space for a new self. If I have time, let me conclude with Giovanni Bresciani. I mentioned him before, but I'm in love with Giovanni because he shows quite well how religious dissent could be a voluntary act and a tool for finding its own place in the world. Well, at the beginning of the 18th century, he was out of work, and his family resources did not enable him to improve his condition. His reflections must have originated from his personal situation. How could God provide for so many bad people but abandon him? He clearly did not see in himself as too bad. This consideration of an autobiographical nature interacted with a series of questions, of which he probably already had a somewhat confused perception, about the presence of the divine justice. He asked himself why God had allowed Judas to betray Christ and Adam to pick the apple, thereby condemning both to damnation. God had certainly not shown himself to be fair, and Giovanni became convinced that he had to go to Geneva, I quote, and preach against the faith of Christ there. He never managed it though. He spoke about it to many people and concluded that he should go to the Holy Office and confess his thoughts. It was 1709, and he had to consider that in any case he needed to find answers to both his existential and financial problems. He therefore joined the Augustinian monks in Treviso as a novice, but immediately found grounds to quarrel with the master of the novices, and he was defrocked without being reimbursed the money he had paid upon entering the monastery. Such an injustice simply triggered his propensity to build a causal nexus and made him return to the ideas that he had tried to abandon. In this way, he moved rapidly from criticizing the behavior of the monks to the religion itself. Overcome with rage, and here I think it's better to let him speak for himself, he declared to many that the religion in question was responsible for a lot of robbery, and that investitures was introduced to eat up people's money. From this discourse and from this thought of mine, I turned my mind to reflect on the dispensations which are obtained from Rome, and reflecting that in order to obtain dispensations and indults, you need to spend money. I began to doubt whether you should believe in the Pope when he did everything out of self-interest, and that as a consequence, not even our law was good. I went further. I started to doubt whether the mystery of the Incarnation was true, telling myself that the Madonna was a woman like all the others, and that it was not possible for God to have sent his Son to take a human form in the womb of a woman similar to the others who had been born into this world too. In addition, I believed that the resurrection of the dead was false. Indeed, I believed that the death of man was similar to the death of animals, so that I denied that our soul was reasoning, saying that it was only sensory, and that after this life I didn't believe there was anything else. Pondering over the apple forbidden to Adam and reflecting that God had forbidden it, also knowing that Adam wouldn't obey him, I deduced as a consequence that if God knew this, but nevertheless prohibited it, it was a sign that God wanted us to be evil and caused us to be so. Furthermore, I stated to hate all things ecclesiastical, namely all the services that they have in church, telling myself that there was nothing there was good. And so I continued with this false belief for a period of almost 3 years, and I expressed it in two ways. Sometimes I pretended to report them as arguments put forward by heretics, and so on. He consequently took his rebellion to the utmost extreme by invoking the devil, even though he had previously claimed that he did not believe in him, in order to give him his soul in exchange for favors. He did not obtain much from this, except even a firmer knowledge of the non-existence of life after death. He subsequently sneered mockingly at people he saw bowing them before the altar. Before finding some consolation in the figure of Antonio Legrenzi, the 18 years old son of a cloth merchant who had the same feelings as him. Every time that they met in the streets or elsewhere, we both took heart in not believing in anything. That there is no hell or purgatory or heaven or real Pope or God or sacraments or the Blessed Virgins, and we say to each other, speaking about the Blessed Virgin, she should go and spin, she would better go spinning. And on one day, I don't remember in which year or in which season or in which place, on seeing a painted crucifix, Legrenzi turned to me and said, while smiling and jeering at it, look, and they say that it is Christ, che mustazzo da Giuda, and I applauded him and agreed with him. This reciprocal action of taking heart to persevere in their incredulity was the main voluntary component of their unbelief. They continued to cultivate it by visiting churches together for the pleasure of making fun of those taking part in the service. When the priest raised the host, they said in turn, they are lifting the Lord, look, the Lord is over there, look at those who are worshipping the Lord, and then they laughed. Once again, however, the Synderesis that Giovanni heard led him to appear before the Inquisitor of his own accord. 2 months later, he was followed by Legrenzi. They both adjourned without any further consequences, and the Holy Office never learned anything more about what they believed or said. Me too, I didn't know anything else about what they do. Thank you so much for your patience. I finished.
I want to first of all thank Aviv for the invitation to come and speak to you here and comment about Federico's paper, and of course to thank him for such a rich and thought-provoking talk and materials. And of course, thank all of you for coming. I hope that the allure of the discussion was as strong as the allure of the food that we're supposed to get in the near future. We'll see about that. I will try to keep my comments brief and basically do two things here. First of all, put the talk into a broader context of the importance of the history of unbelief or atheism in early modern Europe. And second, to raise a set of brief questions that can allow for opening up the discussion as a way to setting it up in the next half of the session. First of all, the importance of unbelief for the history of early modern Europe. Basically, one of the strongest themes in early modern history is the story of modernization through secularization, meaning that Europe moved putatively from an age of faith, in which the church was the strongest social institution, to an age of incredulity that allows us to say that approximately by 1900, everybody was supposed to have been so much imbibed, I would even say, of disbelief, that the common saying in the trenches in World War I, that there are no atheists in foxholes, had to make sense only against the backdrop of such a world which has been radically secularized. And if this is the view we're taking, atheism is a serious motive for change, because it explains how we got from being part of an age of faith into a modern age which is supposedly secular. It also means that it becomes very easy for historians to organize the early modern period according to as stops on the way to a secular society, with the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolutions, and the Enlightenment all becoming wayposts or signposts along the way to secularism, whatever that means. However, there are problems with such a view. First of all, we no longer believe so strongly in secularization as people did even 20 years ago. And today, even 18th century philosophers are seen as more often than not striving towards some sort of an accommodation with theological institutions than they were 20 years ago. Second, we do have clear cases of unbelief even around 1500 that such a view really does away with. To give you one brief example, a woman called Elizabeth Sculthorpe, who appeared at the Bishop's Court in Lincoln in 1519 to defend herself against the evidence presented against her. And I'm quoting from an article by David Woolton on this. At first, she says that since Whit Sunday last she had not had perfect nor steadfast belief in God, nor since that time she had no manner good mind to come to the church, nor to serve God, and for the most part she has not come to church, and she has not believed in the holy sacrament of the altar, not in any other sacrament of the Holy Church. So it raises really the question of what kind of backdrop should we assume for the history of unbelief. Is it a society based on faith in which everybody was supposed to be a churchgoer or a believer? Or is something often done in the scholarship that Federico was alluding to here in the image of Carlo Ginzburg, in which we're talking about a really popular attitudes which are mostly materialist and sometimes not really faithful in the way the church tried to inculcate in the 16th and 17th centuries. People believing things like that when somebody dies, you should open the window because the soul has to get up and go to heaven. And if the window is closed, it will, of course, bump in the way. A really non-orthodox theological concept. But thanks to the classical but often misused and misquoted work of Lucien Febvre, we've been taught to take cases like Elizabeth Sculthorpe and see them really not as something too serious. Since Elizabeth, or people like her, could not, in theory, provide serious intellectual argumentation sustaining and supporting their unbelief. In that sense, Febvre claimed, a really socially meaningful unbelief could only come into fruition around 1650, in the middle of the 17th century, once the arguments of people like Descartes has created the possibility of believing in a world which is basically being perhaps set up by God, but leading the way towards a really non-interventionist God, and then putatively leading the way to more serious forms of unbelief or atheism. Such a form of argumentation and the debates it created lead to two interrelated biases that I think that Federico's work really deals with in a very, very useful and thought-provoking manner. The first of all is that a focus on high intellectual history, in which the protagonists are taken to be serious philosophers, people like Thomas Hobbes, a very good, strong case for an atheist in the 17th century, if there ever was one, or Paolo Sarpi, who was active in Venice in the early 17th century. The second is a tendency to look for systematic arguments that would justify atheism. For example, the notion of a corpuscular cosmos consisting of small atoms that are bumping into each other could very easily lead support to unbelief if you combine it with the notion that the world was randomly created. So you suddenly have a much stronger support for a notion that there was no creation, there was no God, and we have a fully materialistic cosmos. Federico's work counters these two tendencies by showing us day-to-day unbelief in its social context. In this particular case, the city of Venice in the second half of the 17th and this first half of the 18th century. And it even specifies certain distinctions that allow us to see when and how people felt free to express forms of unbelief. It's different doing it at night in learned conversation than it is during the day on the Rialto. The second contribution is to show how unsystematic such expressions of disbelief could be. The image that we get from his paper is of unbelief as a form of bricolage. People being able to take bricolage. People being able to take in these materials from different things and just combine them almost haphazardly into something which is their own making and is not a philosophical system that was supposed to have been created by a great mind. And I think that for the sake of opening the discussion, I would like to raise 3 questions related to this form of argument that would hopefully allow us to get into the argument at greater depth and to perhaps to connect them to other topics which are of interest to most of the people in attendance here. First of all, about the model of social distinction. Federico's paper underscores the importance of adopting a posture of unbelief as a way of distinguishing oneself from the hoi polloi or the common people. If you say that you're not a believer, you are, in some way or another, part of the elite, or at least making a claim to be something like this. But I'm wondering, how can we discuss the reasons for such an option becoming suddenly attractive in the 17th century? Why would people choose such a form of distinction in relation or in contrast to other potential forms? If contributing to the church had been a very good way of distinguishing oneself in the past, what was new that allowed people to choose this form? I think that there are 2 larger issues lurking in the background here. First, the growing complexity of European society, accompanied by a broader range of strategies for social distinction and a broader circulation across the continent. I think the best example that comes through in the paper is the notion of galanterie. We saw the example of somebody claiming to be a galantuomo, because it is a way of saying that you're an unbeliever. But this is a model that circulated widely, and in most of its canonic formulations in the 17th century was still seen as something which is very much related to piety in a very traditional sense. Most of its codifications very strongly underscore how you can still be pious and both galant in that sense. The second issue is the presence of the book in the written word, which made ideas previously available only to a very select few much more accessible to broader public. And I think that this is a phenomenon that we still don't have a really clear grasp on, in spite of work done in the past decades, about really the uses people could have made of the new access to the written word. And I think that we're seeing here very interesting examples of it. It also, of course, relates to the notion of what kind of backdrop we're assuming for unbelief. If we're talking about access to the written word, we have a very different picture than talking about a background of folk atheism which is coming to the foreground because of processes taking place in the 16th and 17th centuries. Which brings me to the third issue I wanted to raise, which are the particularities of the institutional context, both for Venice and for the church and state in the 16th and 17th centuries. First of all, Federico has mentioned that Venice was no longer in harmony with the Counter-Reformation Church. But the question one can pose to that was Venice ever in harmony with the Counter-Reformation Church? Venice had a strong tradition of semi-autonomous comportment vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. And even in the Venetian Holy Office, there was a strong representation of the city patricians. So it was not strictly what we would call a church, a Catholic, a pure institution, an institution purely governed by the interest of a centralizing Catholic Church which was developing its bureaucracy in the 16th century. And there is a long history of conflicts. The most prominent of those is the interdict crisis of 1605 and 1606 that allowed somebody like Paolo Sarpi to write one of the most vicious books written about the Catholic Church, The History of the Council of Trent in the early 17th century. It also means that we can ask the same question about the institutions of the Catholic Church itself. If we're talking about an age of confessionalization, in which churches of all types, Catholic, Calvinists, and others, were striving towards a clear articulation of the standards of belief and belonging into the community, doing this hand in hand with the political authorities, to what extent can we say that clear definitions of orthodoxy are related to clear definitions of unbelief? Again, if those things go together and really emerge together over the 17th century, the question of what was the situation around 1500 becomes almost moot, because it is not relevant whether they were strong believers in the age of faith or not, because we're looking at the process of co-constitution. So looking at the broader context of what were those institutions doing and saying something more about this could potentially help us understand better how could people living on the street in late 17th and early 18th century Venice really relate to and appropriate these forms of discourse. Thank you.